It's an actual new song. New song. So, as I alluded to earlier, the great and busy week that we had, um, I'm going to have to, like Laura said, I think it was it was definitely the first camp I've ever done, while also pastoring, because the year that I was pastoring the Journey Church in Colorado, I know for sure that was not the year when I was helping with camp. And so I love how God works, because this week I was waking up close to normal time, a little bit earlier, but I was spending almost an hour in the arena spraying it down so that we didn't die of dust inhalation, even though every day I'm sure we all had to clean our sinuses out still from all the dust, but it was not nearly as bad as it could be. And so that hour that I spent doing that, and then the little bit more helping with the preparations to set up, is normally the time that I spend in the office reading, studying. And so it was an interesting week trying to squeeze that in. And so, but in that and doing that and knowing ahead of time what we were going to be over and talking about, it was cool how God actually fit that in to what he is talking about here. And so before we go into chapter 12, a quick recap of where we were at. So in chapter 11, the first half of chapter 11, we were talking about how at that time the language was all one. It was one people. They were supposed to go, be, fruitful, multiply throughout the earth. So they were supposed to spread out. And they didn't. And they kind of went to one area, which is in Shinar, which would be modern day Iraq. And they started to build this ziggurat, or the Tower of Babel, as it's called. And they were building this so it could reach into the heavens. And so God came down and he confused their language so that they would scatter. And so what we saw last time we were together was the genealogy of Shem. And so we kind of got a brief genealogy of all three of Noah's sons. But now last week we got a very detailed description of Shem's genealogy. And the reason why we got that detailed description of Shem's genealogy is because through the line of Shem is what we call the seed line. And the seed line is what eventually, the genealogy will eventually lead to Jesus. And so in this genealogy, we saw that they listed everyone from Shem all the way to Abram. And to finish off the chapter last week, they talked about, God talks about how the time of Terah, who is the father of Abram, how long he lived. And so in order to do that, it gave a brief description of where they were, what happened, how many years he lived. And so we saw that they had left Ur, went to Haran, and they dwelt there. And that's when it says that Terah had lived 205 years before he died in Haran. And so that's where we pick up for chapter 12. And so chapter 12, now we are going to see God speak to Abram, which will actually be the second time he has said this, but it's the first time that it's recorded in Genesis. And so there's a journey that's happening here. And so let's pick up in chapter 12, verse 1, and we're going to read 1 through 3. It says, "Now the Lord had said to Abram, 'Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so here we have a message from God to Abram that is a blessing to him and all his descendants. He's going to make him a great nation of people. He's going to take them to a land that they are going to be able to inherit, that God's going to give to them. And here, the first part, when God calls Abram out, you can tell by what he says, get out of your country and from your family. That is the country where they were at originally in Ur. And so one thing to know about Ur is this was a very, very rich place. So I don't know about the rich parts of Idaho Falls. I'm sure they're probably by golf courses and stuff like that. But like when I think about different places in the country, this would be, a place where there are tons and tons of rich people. Like in Phoenix, it was Scottsdale, Arizona, or Cave Creek was a place where all the rich people kind of gathered. And that's what Ur was. Ur was a place where back then they would have the gold chariots and they would have the Frisian horses. They'd have the nice fancy ones. They wouldn't have mules or donkeys. They would have nice, elegant animals to pull their chariots. And it was actually a place where, guess what luxury that we use, probably not on a daily basis anymore, but we used to. But it was the birthplace of the bathtub. It's the first place where they installed bathtubs. And so you could lay and relax and wash up in the privacy of your own home instead of going out to the lake or the river. So it was a posh place. And so when you think about that place, there was money, there was obviously wealth, there was a lot of respect that went to the rich people, there was a lot of power. And we know from the story of Abram and his family, when they were there, he was a leader among leaders in this area, and he got the respect, he had the power, and he had the wealth when it came to those things. So this is a man who had everything, and then he left. God called him away from those things, and he left. And then in verse 2, we see that God is telling him, I'll make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. So in this, remember in the last part of chapter 11, it said that Sarai, is her name at this point still, was barren, right? Well, this was promised to him before they knew that she was barren. When God originally spoke these words to Abram, it was when he was 50 years old, and it's not until he's 75 that he actually completely fulfills what God called him to do. There's a 25-year gap in between, and in that 25 years before he actually left Haran to go into the land that God promised him, now you would understand, there was many, many years between this promise and them being frustrated that she was barren. And it's like, how are you going to make a nation out of us if my wife can't even have a kid? And she was like, how can I give my husband a nation if I can't even have a child? And so now you can kind of see why the frustration was there, because this wasn't just a short trip from Haran to the border, to the promised land, which would have literally been weeks, maybe a couple of months, not 25 years. And so the frustration was growing over many, many years. But it's cool because one of the things that he had before he left was wealth, power, and respect. And so he's leaving all that behind, but God is promising him that his name will be great and he shall be a blessing to many. And so he will also be blessed. And so he's giving up everything that this world has to offer in order to take what God has to offer him. And I think about that because I think about how today, in today's day and age, how sometimes I think we don't give up the things that God is calling us to give up to take what He has that's best for us. We think, well, God wouldn't have given me this security in this. He wouldn't pull me away from it. God doesn't want me to be insecure in my footing. But what we don't understand is the things that we think we have from this world that are a secure base, a secure foundation, is actually crumbling below us. How many of you guys maybe owned a house in 2008? What happened in 2008? Yeah, your nice $300,000 home was all of a sudden only worth $150,000, right? Almost overnight. And so think about that. What God calls us to, we think, hey, real estate's a great investment, and it still is. I'm a real estate agent, so I'm not trying to talk myself out of a job here. It's still a great investment long term. But you go through times like that. We went through a time like that, and we're kind of still in it right now, right? Not as devastating as that time was, but people think, okay, we're back on track, and we can invest in this real estate, and we can make money this way, and it's still a great investment. But if we think that's our security, from time to time, the foundation is going to crumble below us. And we're actually going to see a little bit about real estate from our friend Abram here. But we can't put our faith in the things that this earth says gives us stability, because the foundations of the earth will crumble below us, but the things that we rest our house upon, on the Lord, will be forever. And so it's that blessing and that greatness. And then in verse 3, to kind of break that one down, I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you. So how many of you guys love history? I know I love history. And so what happened to the Egyptians after they abused and enslaved the Jewish people? Fell apart, right? What happened to the Greeks after they did the same thing and then desecrated their temples? There they go. So then what happened to the Romans? Fell apart, right? What happened to Germany? Destroyed. I will curse those who curse you. Never in the history has anybody ever been able to curse Israel, enslave Israel for any given amount of time without facing their own destruction. And we know the end of the story because God has given it to us, and we know at the end of the story the same thing is going to happen, right? Same thing is going to happen. Everybody is going to come against Israel from all sides, and they will be defeated. He will curse those who curse you. And the beginning part of that, I will bless those who bless you. So I have a question for you. This is a real life, recent history, ongoing history. But can you tell me a country that has been blessed because of its close ties to Israel? Huh? America. So, do you think if we start pulling away from that close relationship, matter of fact, we've already kind of seen it started. Slowly, there is a very slow erosion that is happening within our government to kind of ease back. It's not happening in a quick fashion, but ease back a little bit because nobody wants to get canceled. Nobody wants to put their neck out, but we're easing back from that relationship. And then it's no wonder that we continue to see our economy has gotten a little bit more wishy-washy. We've always had an economy. No matter what you do, the world economy has peaks and valleys. But the thing is, how many of you guys know about tracking earthquakes? And you see that seismic, it starts doing one of these. They get closer and closer and closer and closer, and then all of a sudden, you have your earthquake, right? Our economy does that. If you look at the history of the economy, you got your peaks, you got your valleys, you got your peaks, you got your valleys, and it's kind of that heartbeat. Beep, beep, beep. But what happens when that heartbeat starts going beep, 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 beep? What's the next sound? Beep. Right? And so the nations that have blessed Israel have been blessed. I mean, we are living proof of that in the United States. We went into World War II for various reasons. We are human. We were not in singular thought process of we're going in to save the Jewish people, because that just isn't the reality. But it was one of the things that we did while we were there and going in along with our allies in Europe. But after, there was an establishment to move them back into their nation. And so 1948, they got their nation back, and we helped them with that. We've been friendly with them. We've been in open communication, both economically, military, all the different aspects of trying to nation build. And so all of those things, God is promising to Abram at this point. And so one of the things I want to read, if we want to flip over to Acts chapter 7, so you say, well, Scott, this happened in chapter 12, chapter 11, says that it doesn't say that he knew, but we're going to read Stephen when he was preaching, and he was brought in front of the Pharisees because they didn't like the message that he was speaking. And this is all part of his only sermon. How would you like to give one sermon and then be stoned to death? Man, that would have been January 2nd for me. Actually, I gave sermons before that, but so thank goodness it wasn't me. But I just want to read a few verses here in chapter 7, starting with verse 2. It says, and he says, brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. All right, so see, it's saying before he was in Haran. And we know what we just read was from when he was in Haran. So that's how we know that it was a reiteration of what God asked of Abram. And he said to him, get out of your country. So he was supposed to get out of his country, right? And Haran was still in that country. Get out of the country and from your relatives. Who went with him to Haran? His dad, right? His dad, and it even says that his dad took him there. So his dad, Terah, knew of what that command was from God. And so Abram couldn't leave his family, and so his dad had to take him part way. And it says, and come to the land that I will show you. Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. And so we see here from Acts chapter 7. My daughter's still in Genesis. Acts chapter 7. So what we're seeing here is that Stephen is telling them this was the original command that God gave Abram. And Abram didn't follow it. And it even says here that God did not give him, Abram that is, an inheritance in the land even big enough to put his foot on. And so we're seeing here that it took quite some time for Abram to actually be obedient and following his commands. So here's a question for you. So based off of what we know so far and the things that we know going forward, Abram, soon to be called Abraham, was not obedient for 25 years, correct? Did God punish him for it? He didn't get an inheritance, but did God still do what he promised to do? Right? Yeah, we wouldn't be sitting here if he didn't, right? God had a plan. He wasn't going to stop his plan because he said, I promise that I will give you descendants and they'll be a great nation. I will make your name great. Right? It's God saying, I will. So I got a question for you. How many times in your life have you thought, I just don't know what God's calling me? I just feel like he's not speaking to me. I feel like God is silent. I think this gives us an important lesson here, because I truly believe that everything that we read throughout the Bible, and there are other situations just like this, where people of faith don't do what God commands them to do right away. And what happens in their life? They get on cruise control, right? And they're like, God, why are you not speaking to me? We see in the Psalms, there are several Psalms where they cry out, God, why have you stopped speaking to me? Why have you left me? And God says, I am still here. And so my question is, has he asked you to leave? Has he asked you to go? Has he asked you to do something? When you're in a time in your life when you're like, God is silent, I don't hear him talking, maybe it's a good time to rewind and say, when did this start? And what happened around that time? And what did God call me to do? For 25 years, Abram resided in Haran, in a place he shouldn't have been, because he should have continued on with people he shouldn't have been there with, right? I get it. It's his dad. When we moved to Colorado, one of the things that I know was an anchor for me in Arizona was my mom. And I know a lot of times people hear me talk about this and they're like, wow, it's kind of cold-hearted, or, you're making God out to sound like a bad person. It's like, no, God's not a bad person. God will do his will, and he has a time and a place, and we have a specific amount of time on the face of this earth, and he will use all those things together for his good. I had a daughter that passed away. That's not a great thing, but guess what? God used my daughter passing away to give me compassion for people who have lost loved ones. Well, one of the things during this time that was an anchor for me was my family, and a big part of that was my mom. And out of all 5 siblings, I was the only one through all the years that continued to go to Sunday evening dinner every single week with my parents. None of my other siblings did. They'd have times where they'd stay away, times when they came, but I continued to go. And it was almost clockwork when we finally said, God, we know what you are calling us to do. We know that you're calling us to leave. And it was within weeks that my mom was diagnosed with glioblastoma, brain cancer. And so, as devastating as that was for me, she knew right before that we had talked about leaving. And so we stayed there, stayed by her side, and one of the things that she said in the last month and a half before she passed away, she was almost completely silent. She didn't talk. She couldn't form full sentences. It had eaten so much of her brain. She's just laying there. And one of the things, as I was sitting by her bedside, was She said, Scott, come here. And I leaned over and she said, I know God has called you. And I know he's called you to go start this ministry. And I want you to know that I'm sorry I've held you back. And you have to go. You have to follow God. It's the only thing she said in that month and a half that was at all lucid and you could understand. And I know that that was God taking an anchor away from me. Like Abram probably had the same thing. And he was like, I can't leave my dad behind. I've got to take him with me. And he took him with him. And he delayed the promises by 25 years, the fulfillment. Now, God knew that there would be that time. But that's why I tell you, if there's ever a time when you're not sure and you're like, I don't feel like God's talking to me, go back. What has he asked you to do already that you're not doing today? Don't let 25 years for them, it wasn't as big a percentage of their life. 25 years for us, it's pretty big. It's about a third. Let's move on to verse 4. We're going to read 4 through 6. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Morah. And the Canaanites were then in the land. And so, like I said, he was 50 when God first commanded him, and now it's saying he's 75, 25 years. Could you imagine God saying, it's time to move? And you're like, okay, I hear you, God. And then 25 years later, you move. It's like 25 years of people that you could have spoken to, could have fed into, that you just waited too long. And so 25 years and they get to the border. And I kind of think about this. We watched a movie that kind of showed this, but I kind of think about this because think about who he is. And so he is of this seed line, right? He's of Shem. And who are the Canaanites from? Ham. Ham and Shem didn't get along. Their genealogy lines, their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids, they really, really did not get along. And so this was a very hostile environment. Could you imagine God saying, Lance, I would like you to go to the land of the Iranians, and you are going to go there, and you are going to build a people there, and I am going to give you that land. And Lance coming to the border of Iraq and Iran, he goes, all right, here's the line. I'm going to step over this line and trust God, and there's all these people that would just as soon cut off my head, but I'm going to follow God into this land. That was Abram. He's coming into a land that was hostile towards him and his people. And so I think, wow, what kind of faith? And we know that he becomes a father of faith. But let's go to 12:7. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And so Abram comes to that line and he says, God says, this land I'm going to give to you. And so he's standing at this place and he's like, everything that I see, God is going to give me. And so he built an altar, and you know that when they build an altar, it's to remind them of the promises that God gave them. How many of you guys seen The Lion King? Yeah, everybody? I was going to say, if there's anybody that doesn't raise their hand, I'm like, we're totally watching it for our potluck. Mm-hmm. Do you remember when Simba was taken by his dad? Mufasa. Oh yeah, sorry. How could I forget that? Mufasa. Yay, say it again. Mufasa was sitting there with Simba after he had just saved him, right, from the hyenas. And they were sitting there, and it was this nice father-son moment, and they're sitting there, and they're looking out, and the sun is kind of up, it's starting to set. And he said, Simba, he goes, all that land, everywhere where the light touches is your land. But anywhere where the shadows touch is not. And so I kind of think of that. Abram standing there, and maybe he's on a cliff. I don't know where he's at exactly, if there's a cliff or on the top of a mountain, but I can picture God right there like Mufasa saying, all this land is yours. I'm going to give it to you and your descendants to inherit. And so he built an altar. And in verse 8 he says, and he moved from there to the mountains east to Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. And so then it says he moves on a little bit further, and he has Bethel on one side, a city named Ai on the other, and he builds an altar, pitches his tent, and that's where he's camped out. And so I think about that. So why would Abram not build a house? So we're talking about a guy who's got a lot of resources, a lot of wealth, right? He was that way when he was in the city of Ur, and then they went to Haran, and then what did it say when he left Haran? All the things that they had accumulated there as well, they took with them. And so we've got a Abram who's got all this stuff and all this wealth, and he moves, and what's he do? He pitches a tent. It's because we remember from Acts chapter 7 that he will get no inheritance of that land, not even big enough for him to put his foot on. And so he is not putting roots down where he knows he is not going to be receiving any inheritance. He is being obedient in getting there, but he knows that he will not get an inheritance himself from that land. And we'll see more of that as we go through the next couple of weeks. But another interesting thing, so the two towns that he was in between, right? Bethel and a city named Ai. Those translated are the house of God and literally dump. Yeah, he's in between. Guess where we reside? We're not of this world, right? But we're not in the house of God yet, right? We reside in the same place that Abram did. We're in between heaven and a dump. It's kind of cool. Sometimes I really like the translations of the words from Hebrew into English. But he pitched his tent in that place because God called him there. And that's what God calls us to. He doesn't call us to pitch our tent, right? Because we're not permanent residents here. He doesn't call us to pitch our tents in the dump in this world. But he doesn't call us to build a tower to try to get to heaven, right? And we can't get to heaven yet, not on this side of the grave. And so God calls us as believers to pitch our tent somewhere in the middle so that we can be witnesses to those on this earth while simultaneously being closer to the one who created us. And so it's a beautiful picture in this story of how Abram, when he was finally obedient and he goes and God promises these things and he shows them the land that he's going to be able to inherit, or his descendants will be able to inherit, and where he decides to pitch his tent, and he builds another altar. If you ever get a chance, I never have, so I'm hoping I get the chance as well, but if you ever get the chance to go to Israel, that land, they actually have preserved many of these altars that they talk about in the Old Testament. and you can go to them and you can read about these altars and who placed them there and why they were there, and you can go back and say, I know that scripture, I know that story, that's so cool. I'm standing in a place where Abram stood and said, Bethel's over here, Ai is over here, and this is the altar that he built to God because of God's faithfulness to his promises, not because of his faithfulness or what God is going to do for him, but because of what God can do for all mankind. And so, verse 9, the last part of this before it goes in, it says, So Abram journeyed, going on still towards the south. And so this is your teaser for next week. So he pitched his tent. He didn't stay there forever, right? He's going to continue to go south. And so he will be constantly on the move. It's part of that not getting an inheritance because it was a promise for his descendants and not for him. And so he moves on. And so really the biggest thing that we can learn from this today is really two things. One, are you in a place where you feel like you're in a desert and you feel like God hasn't been speaking to you? And if that's the place where you're at today, I say go back, rewind, and say, when did I feel God stop talking to me, and what did he say to me right before? You know, a good example of that, I think all of us guys can probably attest to this one, but maybe they're at a point and you're like, you know, my wife really hasn't said much to me lately. And so in your head, you kind of rewind and you're like, when's the last time we were talking? You're like, we had that argument. I said this, she said, oh, now I remember why. You're like, I thought it was just peaceful, but I'm actually in trouble. You have to rewind, right? And sometimes we got to do that with God. We got to say, what did he ask me to do? What is it that maybe I'm not doing that he asked me to do? And I usually will say this is a little side note, but sometimes I will say this, most of the time I'll say this to people where they're walking and wandering, and I'm like, what has God asked you to do? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, well, okay, if you don't remember what God asked you to do, and you can't go back and figure it out, I said, what has God called all of us to do? And they're like, well, I don't know, because what he asked you is different for me. And I said, no, he asked me the same thing. He asked you the same thing. He asked you the same thing. He asked you guys the same thing. He goes, God asked the same thing of all of us. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them, right? Don't forsake being assembled, coming together, for reading his word, the doctrine. We talked about this on yesterday for our men's group, when we were talking about being a part of a church. He asks us the same things. So we all have the basic foundation is exactly the same in our lives. Now, I used to be a baseball player. I love softball. I obviously can talk without stopping. Things that I'm passionate about, right? Lance is different. You know, he's not a baseball player. He's a skateboarder. You know, you love softball. It's kind of similar to me, right? I love softball, baseball. Laura loves horses. Caleb loves basketball. You know, everything is different. We have an amazing photographer in the back of the room. And, you know, all of our passions are different, right? But the foundation is the same. And so when you think about, well, what has God called me to do? He's called you to make disciples. How are you going to do that? Well, what did God give you passion to do? Because through those passions is how you are going to win people over. Starting a horse ministry, I guess, would be a big one. You know, with Laura and I, that's how we did it. We had a passion for horses. We had a passion for kids. We had a passion to bring those two together, and we have a passion for God. And so we know that God gave us the other two passions, so we use those to do exactly what he asked us to do. And so rewinding, figuring out what was God's last command to me. And so if you already know that, then part number 2 is obedience. Go do it. Don't hesitate. Don't wait 25 years to do what God's called you to do today, right? 25 years he waited. So go and do it. It's obedience. When he calls and he asks, go. And sometimes it's the hardest thing you ever have to do. I can tell you, even when God opened the door for us to leave Arizona and go to Colorado, it was still the hardest thing I had ever done in my life, because I had a brother in his family, I had a sister in his family, and I had my dad, who 12 months earlier, almost exactly, 12 months later, it was walking away from my dad, who just lost the most important person in his life. And I was moving to a different state. It was still the hardest thing. When we moved from Montrose to here, it was still a hard thing to do, but you have to do it when he asks. You can't wait. He doesn't want you to wait. And when you wait, there are consequences. They may not be bad to you. They might be bad for somebody else. You never know what's going to happen. God knows those things ahead of time. We can't outwit him. But when we talk about the blessings that we get when we follow God, it's when we follow God when he calls. Not when God calls and we follow at our convenience. And we see that in Abram's life. And so those are my 2 things that I would want us to take away. Remember what he said. Go and do what he has asked you to do, no matter how crazy it seems. Let's pray. God, I just thank you for this time that we can come together and open your word. And I thank you for your word and the record of history that we're able to go back and see even a pillar of faith like Abraham and how his life played out, and be able to take those lessons and apply them to our lives. And God, I just thank you that you are ever faithful to your promises, that it's not based off of our actions or our indecisions or us running away, frankly, at times from what you've asked us to do. God, I just pray that if there is anybody here or listening that hasn't heard from you, or maybe you've asked them to do something and they've been hesitating, God, I just pray that you would put it on their heart to make their obedience today, that they would just set everything aside, every fear, every hesitation, every frustration, whatever it may be that is holding them back, that they would put those things aside and they would say, God, for me and my house, we will worship you, we will follow you, and we will go to the ends of the earth for you. God, give us that strength and that boldness. And I just pray in Jesus' name, amen.